This stuff is worthless. Nobody would ever buy these, and you paid real money to buy this junk.
We'll see.
It snowed 11 inches the night before the sale. Not the gentle kind that settles decoratively on a winter landscape and photographs well. The kind that arrives sideways, driven by wind off the lake. The kind that turns a parking lot into a problem, and a person's breath into something visible, and a January morning in rural Pennsylvania into the specific punishing cold that makes everyone who has to be outside move faster than they want to and complain about it less than they'd like. Daniel Reyes was on his knees in it. He had been there for 20 minutes, in the back lot of the Caldwell Transit Maintenance Facility, brushing snow away from the lower body panel of the 7th bus in a row of 12, looking for a VIN plate that he had found on the first 6 and needed to confirm on the rest before he could finish the calculation that had brought him out here at 7 in the morning and 11 inches of fresh snow. The buses had been sitting in this lot for 3 years, decommissioned, forgotten. The specific kind of forgotten that comes not from neglect exactly, but from a deliberate decision not to look. 12 school buses, parked in 2 rows of 6, their paint fading under 3 winters of weather, their tires soft, their interiors holding the particular cold stillness of machines that have stopped being asked to do anything. Daniel found the VIN plate on bus 7. He wiped the snow from it with his glove. He read the numbers. He wrote them in the notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, the notebook that already had 6 other VIN numbers and 6 other confirmations, and he was reaching for bus 8 when he heard the car doors. He looked up. A black SUV had pulled into the lot. 3 people got out, a woman in a long charcoal coat that had the specific quality of fabric that costs more than most people's monthly mortgage, and 2 others behind her, bundled against the cold in a way that communicated they had not expected to be standing in a snowy parking lot for very long. The woman looked at the 12 buses. She looked at the man kneeling in the snow beside the 7th one. She said, "You paid real money for this junk?" The 2 people behind her laughed, not cruelly exactly, but with the specific, easy laughter of people who have decided, before arriving, what kind of morning this was going to be, and are pleased to find their expectation confirmed. Daniel stood up. Snow on his knees, snow on his shoulders, his breath visible in the cold, his old coat doing the work that the woman's expensive one was doing more comfortably. He looked at the buses. He looked at the woman. He said, quietly, "It's not junk. It's just not finished yet." He went back down on one knee. He kept working. The woman watched him for 1 second longer than she meant to. Then she got back in the SUV. 6 months later, Victoria Caldwell would think about that morning more than any other morning of her adult life, not because of what happened in the snow, but because of what she would not understand about it for 3 more weeks. Victoria Caldwell had inherited a company she did not know how to grieve inside of. Her father, Walter Caldwell, had built Caldwell Transit from a single used school bus and a contract with one rural school district into a regional transportation contractor serving 11 counties, a process that had taken him 22 years, that had nearly bankrupted him twice, and that he had completed with the specific, stubborn persistence of a man who had decided, somewhere in his 30s, that rural kids deserved reliable transportation to school, regardless of whether serving them was profitable in the way that serving denser, wealthier districts was profitable. He had named the company after his daughter, not as a tribute exactly. Walter Caldwell was not a sentimental man in the conventional sense, but as a kind of promise, made out loud in a way that committed him to it. Caldwell Transit. The same name as his daughter's surname, which was also his own, but which he had told her, more than once, he'd chosen specifically, so that every time someone said the company's name, they were saying part of hers. Victoria had grown up around the buses. She had ridden in the cab of the first one bus, number 1, the one Walter had bought used in 1998, and rebuilt himself in their garage over a winter, the same winter she turned 6. She had been in that garage many evenings while he worked, sitting on an overturned bucket with a paintbrush she was technically too young to be trusted with, helping him touch up the new company livery on the side panels, because he had let her, because he believed that a 6-year-old who wanted to help should be allowed to help even if the help required minor correction afterward. She did not remember this clearly. She remembered fragments: the smell of the garage, the cold of the concrete floor through her boots, her father's hands guiding hers on the brush. She did not remember, specifically, painting her own handprint on the rear panel of one of the buses, though she had done it at 6, with the specific delighted spontaneity of a child who has just been given paint and wants to leave evidence of herself in the world. Walter had let it stay. He had painted around it, carefully, for 20 years, every time that bus needed its livery refreshed. Victoria did not remember this either. She had been 31 when Walter died 3 years ago now. A heart attack on a Tuesday morning in his office at the facility. Sudden and complete. The specific kind of death that leaves no time for the conversations people imagine they'll have eventually. She had been working in finance in Philadelphia at the time, successful in her own right, with no specific plan to ever run her father's company, and she had come home for the funeral and stayed for the inheritance, and found herself 8 months later, sitting in her father's office chair trying to understand a business she had never properly learned. She had not been close to her father. Not estranged, nothing so dramatic, just distant, in the specific way that happens between a driven daughter and a driven father, who are too similar in their stubbornness to easily soften toward each other, who loved each other in the assumed background way that families sometimes do without ever quite finding the foreground for it. She had wanted, for most of her adult life, to prove something to him that she could succeed on her own terms, in her own field, without the company, without his help. She had been succeeding. And then he had died before she had gotten around to telling him that his approval, which she had spent 15 years pretending not to need, had in fact been the thing she wanted most, and had never quite asked for directly. She had taken over the company carrying that. She had modernized fast new buses, new branding, new contracts with denser and more profitable districts. The specific accelerated growth of someone who is trying to outrun a feeling by staying relentlessly busy. Caldwell Transit, under Victoria's leadership, had grown 30% in 3 years. By every external measure, she was succeeding at exactly the thing she had always wanted to prove she could do. The old fleet sat in the back lot the entire time. She had told her operations director 18 months ago that the original 12 buses needed to be decommissioned, and cleared they were old, mechanically inconsistent, taking up space that the facility's expansion needed. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Victoria could not walk past that backlot without feeling something she had spent 3 years successfully avoiding feeling anywhere else in her life. She had not asked anyone to assess the bus's value. She had not requested a proper salvage quote, or an auction, or even a basic mechanical evaluation. When her operations director had mentioned an inquiry from a small consulting firm, a man named Daniel Reyes, asking about the decommissioned fleet, she had said, "Whatever he'll pay, I want them gone." The number that came back was $1,000, $83.33 per bus. She had said yes immediately, with the specific relief of someone who has found a way to make a problem disappear without having to look at it directly one more time. She had not asked why a consultant wanted 12 buses that her own company had assessed as not worth keeping. It had not occurred to her to ask. Daniel Reyes had spent 14 years building something that almost nobody outside his profession understood the value of. He had worked as a route logistics analyst for the Tri-County Rural School Transportation Authority, a regional government body responsible for coordinating school bus service across a stretch of rural Pennsylvania, where the nearest school for some children was 40 minutes away by road, and where a single bus breakdown could mean a child missing a week of school, not because anyone was careless, but because rural districts operated with thin margins and thinner backup capacity. It was not glamorous work. It was, however, work that required a specific and uncommon combination of knowledge, federal and state transportation regulations, rural district funding mechanisms, vehicle certification standards, the granular economics of fleet maintenance versus replacement, and the political and bureaucratic landscape of how rural transportation policy actually got made, funded, and implemented, which was almost never the way the public-facing version of the story suggested. Daniel had become, over 14 years, one of perhaps a few dozen people in the country who understood this landscape at a genuinely expert level. He had lost the job 4 years ago. Not through failure, through privatization. The authority had been restructured, its functions absorbed into a private contractor, and Daniel's specific role had been eliminated in the transition, along with 40% of the authority's staff. He had been 41 years old, with a son, Mateo, who was 7 at the time, and a wife, Carmen, who had died the year before from an illness that had moved faster than anyone expected, and that Daniel still, 4 years later, did not fully have language for the way it had reorganized his life. He had taken the job loss hard. Not just financially, though financially it had been hard. The specific compounding hardship of losing income. In the same period he was learning to raise a son alone. He had taken it personally, in the way that people sometimes absorb a structural decision, as though it were a verdict on their worth. Even when they understand, intellectually, that it wasn't. He had built a small consulting practice from his garage. 3 years of slow, careful work districts that needed help optimizing routes. Small transportation contractors that needed fleet planning advice. The occasional state-level project that used his specific expertise in rural transportation economics. It was not a large business. It paid the bills. Mostly, it let him be home for Mateo every day at 3:15. He kept reading. This was the thing about Daniel that his former colleagues would have recognized immediately, and that almost nobody else knew. He had never stopped tracking the field, even after he lost the job that had been his reason to track it professionally. He read the Federal Register. He followed rural transportation policy the way other people followed sports or stock prices, not for any practical purpose most weeks, but because it was the specific intellectual terrain he understood best, and the habit of attention had outlasted the job that originally required it. In November, he had found something. A new federal program, the Rural School Transportation Modernization Initiative, announced with relatively little public fanfare, because its primary audience was administrative rather than political. A grant program designed to address a documented crisis in rural school transportation, where aging fleets in underserved counties were breaking down faster than chronically underfunded districts could replace them. The program had an unusual structure. It offered substantial per-vehicle grants to counties that could demonstrate immediate capacity to deploy certified, mechanically sound buses, meeting a specific pre-2010 federal safety and emissions specification, a specification chosen. Daniel understood from 14 years of knowing how these programs actually got designed. Because newly manufactured buses had an 18 to 24-month production backlog industry-wide, and the program's funding had a strict 2-year use-it-or-lose-it deadline. The program needed buses that already existed, certified, mechanically sound, meeting the specification. Available now. Daniel had read the program guidelines 3 times. Then he had thought about the 12 buses sitting in the Caldwell Transit backlot, which he knew about not through any special insight, but through the ordinary professional grapevine of an industry where everyone eventually heard about everyone else's decommissioned fleets. Because used buses, even unwanted ones, were a market that people in his field paid attention to. He had pulled the chassis specifications. Pre-2010. the exact spec the grant program needed. He had called Caldwell Transit's office and asked about the decommissioned fleet's availability. He had been quoted $1,000 for all 12. He had not negotiated. He had said yes immediately, with the specific contained excitement of a person who has just recognized something that nobody else in the transaction has recognized, and who understands that the value of that recognition depends entirely on moving quickly and quietly before anyone else arrives at the same understanding. He had told Mateo that evening. "Mateo, 12 buses for $1,000? Daniel, yes. Mateo, is that good? Daniel, I think it might be very good. I need to look at the buses first to be sure. But the timing, there's a federal program that needs exactly what these buses are. If I'm right, this could change things for us." Mateo, good things? Daniel, good things. Mateo had looked at him for a moment with the specific assessing quality that 11-year-olds sometimes display when they're deciding how much to trust an adult's optimism. Mateo, can I come see them? Daniel, it's supposed to snow tomorrow. A lot. Mateo, I don't mind snow. Daniel had smiled. Daniel, I know you don't, but I need to inspect them properly first. You can come see them once I know what we have. He had gone alone the next morning, into 11 inches of fresh snow, to kneel beside 12 buses that a woman in an expensive coat would, within the hour, call junk. The transaction had been scheduled for 9 that morning, a simple transfer. Paperwork signed in the facility office. The buses to be collected by Daniel's transport arrangement over the following week. Victoria had not planned to attend personally. She had told her operations director, Hal Brennan, that he could handle it, sign the paperwork, hand over the keys, make sure the buyer understood the buses were sold as is with no warranty or representation. It was a $1,000 transaction for equipment she had already mentally discarded. There was no reason for her to be there. She had come anyway, not because the transaction required her presence, because some restless part of her, the part that had been avoiding the backlot for 18 months, the part that knew, without fully articulating it, that this sale was the final closing of a door she had not properly walked through, yet had decided that morning that she needed to see it happen. That watching the buses leave might produce some resolution, that simply deciding to sell them had not. She had brought Hal and her assistant Priya, mostly because she did not want to be alone, for whatever this turned out to be. They had arrived to find a man already in the lot, on his knees, in the snow, working his way along a row of buses with a notebook and a flashlight, checking something on the lower body panels with the specific methodical attention of someone conducting an inspection rather than simply waiting for a transaction. Victoria had looked at the buses, really looked at them, for the first time in 18 months, faded paint under fresh snow. The specific sad geometry of vehicles that had stopped being useful and had not yet become anything else, and she had felt the thing she had been avoiding feeling arrive anyway. The specific grief that did not announce itself gently, but simply showed up, fully formed. The moment she stopped being able to avoid the sight of them, she had covered it the only way she knew how to cover difficult feelings in front of employees. She had made it a joke. You paid real money for this junk? Hal and Priya had laughed not because the joke was particularly good, but because laughing at what the boss laughed at was a reliable form of workplace currency, and the morning was cold, and laughing was warmer than standing in silence. The man had stood up. He had looked at her with an expression that contained no defensiveness and no embarrassment, just the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had been asked a question and was answering it honestly. "It's not junk," he had said. "It's just not finished yet." He had gone back down on one knee. Victoria had watched him for a second longer than she meant to. There was something in the specific quality of his attention to the buses, the careful way he was checking each one, that did not match her expectation of a person buying 12 unwanted vehicles for almost nothing. People who saw junk did not kneel in 11 inches of snow checking VIN plates with this kind of patience. She had not let herself think further about it. She had gotten back in the SUV. She had told Hal to finalize the paperwork and had driven back to the office, and she had spent the rest of that day in meetings, and she had not thought about the man in the snow again for 3 weeks, because not thinking about things that touched the backlot was a skill she had developed with real proficiency. Daniel had finished his inspection by 10 that morning. All 12 buses, chassis numbers confirmed, mechanical condition assessed bus by bus, 6 of them fully roadworthy with minor service needs, 4 requiring moderate mechanical work, 2 needing more substantial recommissioning but structurally sound. Every one of them meeting the exact specification the federal program required. He had signed the paperwork with Hal in the facility office, out of the snow, and had driven home with the specific contained satisfaction of a man whose professional instincts had just been confirmed by direct physical evidence. He had picked up Mateo from school. "Mateo, how were the buses?" "Daniel, exactly what I hoped they'd be." "Mateo, junk?" Daniel had smiled. "Daniel, the woman who sold them to me called them junk. To my face. In the snow. With her assistant laughing next to her. Mateo, that's rude. Daniel, it's also understandable. She doesn't know what I know. From where she's standing, they probably do look like junk. Mateo, but they're not. Daniel, I don't think so. I think, in about 6 months, those 12 buses are going to be worth more than she could imagine right now." Mateo had considered this with the specific seriousness he brought to things he found genuinely interesting. "Mateo, are you going to tell her?" "Daniel, tell her what?" "Mateo, that she was wrong. When you find out you're right." Daniel had thought about this for a moment, driving through the tail end of the snowstorm with his son beside him. "Daniel, I don't know yet. I think that depends on what I find out." He had not known, in that moment, what he was going to find inside bus number 7. The recommissioning work began in February. Daniel had rented additional space, a larger garage bay on the edge of town, big enough to work on multiple buses, funded by a small loan against the consulting business that he had taken with the specific calculated confidence of a man who had run the math on the federal grant program multiple times and trusted his own analysis. He had hired 2 part-time mechanics, both former colleagues from his authority days, both also victims of the same privatization restructuring, both grateful for work that used the specific skills the industry had stopped valuing them for. They worked through the fleet systematically. By the 3rd week of February, they had reached bus number 7, one of the 4, requiring moderate mechanical work. Its body in reasonable condition, but its livery faded badly enough that Daniel had decided it needed a full repaint before it could be presented to any county for the grant program. He was stripping the old paint himself on a Tuesday evening, alone in the garage after the mechanics had gone home, working the rear panel with a heat gun and a scraper in the specific methodical way he approached every task, when he found something under the 3rd layer of paint. A handprint, small, painted in yellow. Low, on the panel, at a height that suggested it had been made by someone considerably shorter than an adult. He stopped. He worked more carefully around it, clearing the surrounding paint with deliberate care, rather than continuing the stripping process, until the full image was visible, a child's handprint, and beside it, in the same hand-painted lettering style as the company's original livery, 3 lines of text, VC. Age 6 helped paint this one. Daniel stood in the garage and looked at it for a long time. He did not immediately know what he was looking at. He knew generally that company founders sometimes personalized their early vehicles. It was not an uncommon practice in small family-run transportation companies. The specific sentimental habit of people building something from nothing and wanting evidence of the people they were building it for. He thought about the company name, Caldwell Transit. He thought about the initials, V.C. He went to his laptop. He searched the company's history, not difficult to find. A regional business profile from several years back. A local news article about Walter Caldwell's death 3 years ago. A brief company biography on the Caldwell Transit website that mentioned Walter founding the company in 1998 and his daughter Victoria taking over leadership after his passing. He found a photograph from the news article. Walter Caldwell, in his 50s, standing in front of an early Caldwell Transit bus with a young girl beside him. The caption identified her as his daughter, Victoria, at what looked like around 6 or 7 years old. Daniel looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at the handprint on the panel in front of him. He understood, with the specific settling clarity of a piece of information finding its proper place, exactly what he was looking at. This was not just an old company bus. This was the bus Walter Caldwell had built the company on. The first one. The one his 6-year-old daughter had helped paint, in a garage, on a cold evening 20 years ago. Sitting on an overturned bucket with a brush she was probably too young to be fully trusted with. The same daughter who had sold it to him for $83 without knowing what she was selling. The same daughter who had stood in the snow 3 weeks ago and called it junk. He called Mateo into the garage the next afternoon. He showed him the handprint. "Mateo, whose is it?" "Daniel. I think it's the CEO's. Victoria Caldwell. The one who sold us the buses." "Mateo, the one who said it was junk?" "Daniel. Yes." Mateo looked at the small yellow handprint for a long moment. "Mateo, did she know it was here?" "Daniel, I don't think so. I don't think she's looked closely at this bus in a very long time, maybe ever, since she was a kid." "Mateo, why not?" Daniel thought about how to answer this honestly, in the way he tried to answer Mateo's questions honestly, calibrated to what an 11-year-old could hold, but never simplified into something untrue. "Daniel, sometimes when people lose someone, it's hard to look at the things that remind them of that person. Even good things. Sometimes especially good things." Mateo had lost his mother at 7. He understood this in a way that most 11-year-olds would not have needed explained. "Mateo, like how we don't watch the videos of Mom for a long time, and then, one day we do." "Daniel, yes, exactly like that." Mateo looked at the handprint. "Mateo, are you going to give it back to her?" "Daniel, I'm thinking about it." "Mateo, I think you should." "Daniel, why?" "Mateo, because you found something that wasn't supposed to be sold. It was an accident that it got sold. You should fix the accident." Daniel looked at his son for a long moment. "Daniel, when did you get so wise about this stuff?" "Mateo, I don't know. I just think about what Mom would want sometimes, and I think she'd want you to give it back." Daniel was quiet. He looked at the handprint. He made a decision. The federal grant timeline was not flexible. Daniel had spent 6 weeks since the snow morning building the case file that would let multiple rural counties access the modernization grant using his recommissioned fleet coordinating with 3 county transportation directors, working through the certification process with state inspectors, assembling the documentation that would let buses meeting the specification move quickly through a grant program designed for exactly this kind of fast deployment. The numbers, by the end of February, were extraordinary. 11 buses, bus 7 set aside. Its status undecided in his planning even as the other 11 moved forward, distributed across 4 counties under grant-funded purchase and lease agreements that, combined, totaled just over $9.4 million. The counties got certified, safety-compliant rural school buses immediately, instead of waiting 18 to 24 months for new manufacturing. Daniel's consulting business, structured as the intermediary that had sourced, recommissioned, and certified the fleet, received a percentage that would change the trajectory of everything he had built since losing the authority job 4 years ago. It was, by any measure, the most significant professional achievement of his career. He had not told Victoria Caldwell any of it. He had thought about the handprint every day since finding it. He had thought about Mateo's question, "Are you going to give it back to her?" And he had thought about his own answer, which had arrived slowly across several weeks of working on the other 11 buses, while Bus 7 sat, deliberately untouched beyond the initial paint stripping, in the corner of the garage. He understood something about the situation that the pure business logic did not capture. Bus 7 could go into the grant program. It met the specification. It would add roughly $900,000 to the total, by his calculation, if leased to the 5th county that had expressed interest. It could also not go into the grant program. He sat with this decision for several days before making it, turning it over the way he turned over any significant choice, weighing what the math said against what the handprint said, understanding that these were not actually competing considerations because they were not measuring the same thing. He made the decision on a Sunday evening after Mateo was asleep, sitting alone in the garage with Bus 7, its rear panel still showing the bare patch where he had stopped stripping the paint the moment he found the handprint. He decided Bus 7 was not for sale, not to the grant program, not to anyone. He spent the following 2 weeks restoring it properly, not the utilitarian recommissioning he had given the other 11, but a full and careful restoration, mechanical and cosmetic, with the specific attention of someone who had decided that this particular vehicle deserved more than the standard treatment. He repainted the livery to match its original 1998 appearance as closely as he could determine from old photographs. He preserved the handprint, not just left it untouched, protected it, with a careful clear coating applied directly over the original paint, the way a conservator might protect something fragile and irreplaceable, so that the yellow handprint and the 3 lines of text beside it would survive indefinitely under the new finish rather than being painted over or allowed to fade further. VC. Age 6 helped paint this one. He finished the work on a Thursday in March. He called Mateo into the garage to see it. Mateo stood in front of the bus for a long time, looking at the restored livery, the clean paint, the handprint preserved under its protective coating exactly as it had been found. "Mateo, it looks like it did when she was little." "Daniel, that's what I was trying to do." "Mateo, are you taking it to her now?" "Daniel, tomorrow." "Mateo, can I come?" Daniel looked at his son. "Daniel, I think you should." Victoria Caldwell was in her office on a Friday morning in March, when Priya knocked on her door with an expression that suggested something unusual was happening in the front lot. "There's a bus outside," Priya said. "Old livery. It looks like one of ours." "From a long time ago." Victoria looked up from her desk. "What do you mean it looks like one of ours?" "You should come see." Victoria came outside. The March morning was cold but clear. The heavy snow from January long melted, the specific bright quality of early spring light that made everything look slightly more vivid than it had any right to look. A school bus was parked at the entrance to the Caldwell Transit Facility, engine off, livery freshly painted in a style Victoria recognized immediately and had not seen in years. The original company design, the one her father had used in the company's earliest period, before the modernized branding that had replaced it across the fleet over a decade ago. A man stood beside it, the man from the snow. A boy stood next to him, 11 or 12, watching her with the specific open curiosity of a child who has been told a story and is now seeing it arrive. Victoria walked toward them slowly. "Mrs. Caldwell," Daniel said. "I'm Daniel Reyes. I bought 12 buses from your company in January." Victoria looked at the bus. "This is one of them," she said. It was not quite a question. "Bus number 7, Daniel said. "I want to show you something. Before I say anything else." He walked to the rear panel. He stepped back. Victoria followed him. She looked at the panel. She stopped walking. A small yellow handprint, preserved under clear coating, the paint beneath it clean and fresh, but the handprint itself unmistakably old, faded at its edges in the specific way that 20-year-old paint fades even when carefully protected. And beside it, in hand-painted lettering, VC age 6 helped paint this one. Victoria stood completely still. I found it when I was stripping the old paint, Daniel said. 3 weeks after I bought the buses. I didn't know what it meant at first. I looked into the company history. I found out who founded Caldwell Transit. I found out about your father. He paused. I'm sorry. I didn't know any of that when I bought the fleet. I bought it because of a federal program, a grant initiative for rural school transportation that needed exactly this kind of bus. That part is still true. The other 11 buses are going through that program right now. They're going to provide transportation for kids in 4 counties who needed it. That's real, and it's good, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He looked at Bus 7. But this one isn't part of that, he said. I pulled it out of the program. I restored it instead properly, the way I think your father would have wanted it kept. I preserved the handprint. I didn't know what it was when I started stripping the paint. Once I knew, I couldn't sell it. It didn't feel like something that was mine to sell. Victoria was looking at the handprint. She had not seen it in over 20 years. She did not, in fact, fully remember making it. The memory was somewhere below conscious recall, in the place where the earliest things live, accessible more through feeling than through clear recollection. But she remembered the garage, the cold concrete floor, her father's hands guiding hers on the brush, the specific quality of being 6 years old and being allowed, for one evening, to help with something that mattered to the person she loved most. She put her hand against the panel, not quite touching the handprint beside it, on the cool painted metal, her adult hand resting near the small yellow print of the child she had been. She did not say anything for a long time. Daniel and Mateo stood quietly and let her have the time. Finally, she said without turning around, I sold this for $83. You didn't know what it was, Daniel said. Neither did I, when I bought it. I want to be honest about that. I bought 12 buses because of a number on a federal grant table. I didn't know about this until the paint came off. But you gave it back. Once I knew what it was, yes. Victoria turned around. She looked at Daniel, at Mateo, standing quietly beside him. Why? She said. Daniel looked at his son for a moment. Then he said, because my son told me I should. He said I found something that wasn't supposed to be sold, that it was an accident it got sold, and that I should fix the accident. Victoria looked at Mateo. Mateo looked back at her with the steady, uncomplicated honesty of an 11-year-old who has not yet learned to soften what he believes. It's your handprint, Mateo said, not a grant program's. Victoria's composure, which had held through 20 years of distance from her father, and 3 years of running his company without him, and 18 months of avoiding a backlot full of buses she could not look at, did not hold through that sentence from an 11-year-old boy. She put her hand over her mouth. She turned back to the bus. She stood there for a long time. The other 11 buses completed their grant program deployment in April. 4 counties. $9.4 million. Daniel Reyes's small consulting business, 4 years removed from a privatization restructuring that had cost him his career, became, almost overnight, one of the more significant independent players in rural transportation fleet consulting on the East Coast, a position built not on luck, but on 14 years of accumulated knowledge that had simply been waiting for the right convergence of circumstance to matter again. He hired 3 more people that spring. He kept his hours the same. Home by 3:15 every day for Mateo. Bus 7 never went anywhere. Victoria had it parked permanently at the entrance to the Caldwell Transit headquarters, not in the back lot where things were forgotten, but at the front, the place where new buses pulled in and employees parked, and visitors saw the company for the first time. She had it serviced regularly, kept running, kept exactly as Daniel had restored it. She commissioned a placard. It stands beside the bus now, weatherproofed, mounted on a simple post. This is where we started. My father built this company by hand, one bus at a time. I helped paint this one when I was 6. I am still helping. Victoria Caldwell, at the small ceremony when the placard was installed, Mateo asked Victoria a question. "Why did you keep just this one?" he said. "Out of all 12? Victoria looked at the bus, at the handprint, visible through its protective coating, catching the afternoon light. "Because your father taught me something," she said. "Just because something looks like junk doesn't mean it's finished being valuable. It just means somebody stopped looking at it properly." She looked at Daniel. "He looked properly," she said. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. There is a particular kind of value that does not show up on a balance sheet. It does not appear in a salvage assessment or a federal grant table, or the calculations that determine what a thing is worth to a market that has never seen it up close. It lives instead in small yellow handprints, under layers of paint, in 3 lines of hand-lettered text that a father allowed to stay because his daughter had been proud of what she'd done, in the specific quiet conviction of a man who found something he was not looking for and understood, immediately and without needing to be told, that some things are not supposed to be sold even when they technically can be. Victoria Caldwell sold 12 buses for $1,000 because she could not look at what they meant. Daniel Reyes bought them because he understood, with 14 years of specific professional knowledge, exactly what they were worth to a market she had never thought to check. He was right about 11 of them. He was righter about the 12th, though the rightness had nothing to do with federal grants or chassis specifications or the economics of rural transportation policy. It had to do with a 6-year-old girl on an overturned bucket, holding a paintbrush she was probably too young to be fully trusted with, leaving evidence of herself on something her father was building, and a man who found that evidence 20 years later, under 3 layers of paint, and understood the way his own son had to remind him to understand that finding something is not the same as owning it. Sometimes it just means you've been given the job of giving it back.